Summer 1943. Rain fell sideways on the steel matting of the airfield, turning everything into a dull, glinting gray. The Royal Air Force Spitfires stood in neat lines nearby, elegant, poised, like thoroughbreds. And then there was the newcomer. The P-47 Thunderbolt squatted on its landing gear as if daring gravity to take a swing. Its nose was comically oversized, its fuselage a barrel, its landing gear wide and clumsy. British ground crews, used to the slender Merlin-powered Spitfires, stared at it like it had rolled out of a tractor factory. "Looks like a milk truck with wings," muttered one pilot, lighting a cigarette. The Americans weren't sure what to make of it either. Colonel Hubert Zemke, newly in charge of the 56 Fighter Group, had seen it roll onto the field earlier that morning. He'd commanded fighters before, nimble, fast ones, and this thing looked like a flying barn. "I thought we were being handed a flying bathtub," Zemke would later say. "I half expected it to come with a plug in the bottom." The jokes practically wrote themselves. It was too big, too heavy, too slow to climb. Some pilots swore the wings would never lift it. But under that comically large cowling sat something extraordinary. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder monster of an engine. When it roared to life, the ground seemed to shiver. Pilots could feel the vibration through their boots. It drank fuel like a drunk at happy hour, but when throttled forward, it promised something new, raw, brute force. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, one of the first to strap in, remembered his nerves that day. The cockpit smelled like hot oil and rain-soaked canvas. He pushed the throttle, and the big radial engine coughed once, twice, then erupted with a roar that drowned out every sound on the field. Taking off in the jug was an exercise in faith. The plane lumbered forward, wheels bouncing on the uneven strip. For several heart-stopping seconds, Johnson swore it would never leave the ground, until suddenly the heavy bird lifted, slow but sure, and the airfield dropped away beneath him. At altitude, the world changed. The Thunderbolt wasn't graceful, but it was steady, solid. "Like standing on a rock," Johnson would say later. It didn't turn as fast as the Spitfire, but it could dive like nothing else. And it needed to. The Luftwaffe ruled the air over occupied Europe. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had been swatting Allied bombers out of the sky for months. The Americans needed a fighter that could fly escort deep into German territory, fight toe-to-toe with the best the Reich could throw at them, and get their pilots home. On paper, the P-47 seemed a gamble. At over 5 tons loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. Climb rate? Mediocre. Turning circle? Worse than the enemy's. But there was something else, a hint of untapped potential in the way it handled power. Zemke gathered his men in the briefing hut one wet afternoon. Cigarette smoke curled around the rafters as the rain drummed on the tin roof. "Gentlemen," he said, pointing to the blackboard sketch of the Thunderbolt, "this is what we've got. You can laugh at her shape. You can curse her weight. But if you use her right, she'll bring you home." He tapped the nose on the diagram. "This engine will carry you through hell if you let it." The pilots nodded, but there was doubt in their faces. War had a way of punishing overconfidence, and none of them wanted to be the first to find out just how tough this bathtub really was. Their first missions were simple sweeps over northern France, not deep strikes, not yet. The Luftwaffe wasn't taking the P-47 seriously. German pilots saw the ungainly silhouette and thought the Americans had run out of real fighters. And to be fair, even some of the Americans laughed. Zemke himself admitted later that he wondered if they'd been given a bomber with the guns bolted on by mistake. But summer in Europe was heating up. The B-17s and B-24s were flying deeper into German airspace every week. Losses were climbing. The daylight bombing campaign, meant to cripple Hitler's war machine, was at risk of stalling. Soon, Zemke's group would be tasked with escorting those bombers all the way to the Ruhr and back. It would mean tangling with the best of the Luftwaffe, pilots with hundreds of kills, veterans of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. And that's when the Thunderbolt would get its chance to prove what it really was. But by the end of that summer, one ground crewman said, no one would be laughing at the jug anymore. The first real test came on a cloudless morning in late August 1943. The target, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, a deep strike that meant a long, dangerous haul for the B-17 crews. On the hardstand, Thunderbolts idled like angry bulls, their big radial engines snarling. Zemke walked the line, his flight jacket zipped high, goggles perched on his helmet. His wolf pack, young, untested pilots with faces still carrying the softness of civilian life, climbed into their jugs one by one. "Remember," Zemke told them in the briefing hut earlier, chalk dust still on his fingers, "you don't turn with a Messerschmitt. You dive. You strike. You climb. Think of yourselves as falcons, not terriers. Make one clean pass and get out." It sounded simple, until you were staring down a swarm of German fighters. At 20,000 feet, contrails streaked the sky like ghostly highways. The B-17s droned along, steady as metronomes, their silver bellies flashing in the sun. Then the enemy came. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs fell out of the sun in disciplined pairs. The air was suddenly alive with fire, orange tracers arcing through the sky. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, still green from his first few missions, felt his pulse hammer in his ears. He rammed the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney roared like a beast unleashed, and the jug surged ahead. This was where the Thunderbolt revealed its first secret. In a dive, the thing was unstoppable. Its heavy frame turned gravity into a weapon. Johnson pointed his nose down and felt the airframe shake as he passed 450 miles per hour, faster than the Messerschmitt could safely follow without ripping its wings off. Below, a Bf-109 filled his gun sight. Johnson squeezed the trigger. All 8.50 cal Brownings spoke at once, and the world turned into smoke and flame. The German fighter disintegrated in a puff of black smoke. Johnson pulled up hard, his chest pressed against the harness. The P-47 clawed for altitude with stubborn determination. Behind him, another jug rolled in, spitting fire. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the milk truck. Over the next weeks, the P-47s refined their tactics. They learned not to dogfight, not to bleed off energy in endless spirals. Instead, they became masters of boom and zoom. A high-speed dive, a single withering burst, and then a climb back to the heavens. Colonel Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly. "Altitude is your insurance policy," he barked during debriefings. "Spend it wisely." The statistics were starting to tell the story. In September alone, the 56th Fighter Group downed dozens of Luftwaffe aircraft, often with few or no losses. And the jug was proving tougher than anyone had dared hope. Johnson himself became the poster boy for its ruggedness. On one mission, his plane was hit more than 20 times by cannon fire. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. The canopy wouldn't open, and smoke filled the cabin. A Focke-Wulf circled him like a wolf worrying a wounded deer, pouring more rounds into the crippled Thunderbolt. Somehow, impossibly, the jug held together. Johnson kept coaxing it along, praying the engine wouldn't quit. 2 hours later, he landed back at base, his aircraft looking like it had been through a shredder. Ground crew counted the holes. More than 200 punctures. When Johnson climbed out, black with smoke and sweat, one mechanic whistled low. "Sir," he said, "I think she's trying to tell you she doesn't like getting shot at." Word spread fast. Pilots who'd laughed at the jug were now asking for transfers into Thunderbolt squadrons. It wasn't just survivable, it was lethal. The Luftwaffe started to take notice too. German pilots who had once dismissed the P-47 as an easy kill now watched nervously when one appeared overhead. Its silhouette, that big radial nose and broad wings, became a bad omen. But the P-47 was just getting started. By October, the air war was intensifying. The Thunderbolts flew farther, fought longer, and racked up kill counts that turned heads at 8 Fighter Command headquarters. Zemke's Wolf Pack earned a fearsome reputation. They would meet you high, hit you hard, and disappear into the sun before you could react. And still, something was missing. The jug's real transformation was yet to come. The air battles were costly, and while the bomber losses were beginning to drop, they were still heavy. The Allies needed more than air cover. They needed something that could hit German industry, choke supply lines, and smash the Wehrmacht where it hurt most. The P-47 would soon get that job. And when it did, it would stop being just a fighter. It would become a flying sledgehammer. June 6, 1944, D-Day. At dawn, the beaches of Normandy erupted with fire and thunder. The sky over northern France buzzed like a disturbed hornet's nest. While Allied troops stormed ashore, the P-47 Thunderbolts circled above, waiting for their cue to dive. This was the Jug's new war. No longer just high-altitude escorts, they had been fitted with bombs, rockets, and drop tanks, turning them into the most fearsome fighter bombers the Allies had. Colonel Zemke, watching from the operations tent back in England, understood what was at stake. "Our job isn't just to keep the Luftwaffe off their backs," he told his men before takeoff. "Our job is to smash anything German that moves." The Jugs thundered in low over the hedgerows, their wingtips nearly brushing the treetops. Below them, columns of German armor and trucks moved to reinforce the beaches. Lieutenant Robert Johnson later described it as plowing a field of steel. He rolled in at 300 feet, the hedgerows flashing past in a green blur, and released a pair of 500-pound bombs onto a crossroads. The explosion threw dirt and vehicles skyward, the shockwave slamming against the canopy like a giant's fist. And then came the 8 Brownings. Each trigger pull spat 13 rounds a second, a storm of lead that turned convoys into twisted metal. German troops dove for ditches. Tank commanders scrambled to traverse their turrets, but the Jugs were gone before they could fire. The P-47's ruggedness made it perfect for this brutal work. It could take flak hits that would have shredded lighter fighters. Pilots joked that, if you can still count the holes, you're fine, just land her and patch her up. By the end of June, Thunderbolt pilots were flying up to 5 sorties a day. They destroyed tanks, trains, bridges, fuel depots, anything that could slow the Allied push inland. The statistics tell the story. Over 86,000 German rail cars destroyed. More than 9,000 locomotives taken out. Tens of thousands of trucks and armored vehicles blasted. But numbers only hinted at the chaos below. One pilot compared strafing a convoy to mowing the lawn, except the lawn shoots back. Flak guns filled the air with black puffs, shrapnel tearing holes through wings and fuselage. Captain David Schilling once limped home with half a wing missing. He climbed out of the battered Jug, grinned, and said, "She flies better with less weight anyway." Even the Germans began to fear the squat, ugly silhouette overhead. Wehrmacht reports referred to Thunderbolts as J-bows, fighter bombers, and warned units to disperse quickly when spotted. Some soldiers claimed they could feel the ground tremble a split second before the bombs hit. For Zemke, the transformation was personal. The plane he once called a bathtub with wings had become his favorite weapon. He started calling the P-47 the best damn killing machine in Europe. And the Luftwaffe? By mid-1944, they were a shadow of their former selves. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and relentless Allied pressure left them unable to contest air superiority. When they did appear, they were met by Jugs bristling with firepower. Yet the fighting was still deadly. Flak claimed some of the best pilots. Gabreski himself, America's top P-47 ace, was shot down in July 1944 after strafing an airfield. He survived, was captured, and spent the rest of the war as a POW. His legend only grew. Despite losses, the momentum was irreversible. By August, as Patton's tanks broke out of Normandy, the Thunderbolts led the charge from the sky, blowing apart German retreat routes, harassing convoys by day and night. For the men on the ground, the sound of the Jug's radial engine was the sound of salvation. Infantrymen would wave their helmets when they saw the big fighters overhead. And for the Germans, that sound was doom. The ugly Duckling had become a steel sledgehammer, and the Reich was starting to crack. But the Luftwaffe had one last surprise left. As winter closed in, they prepared a desperate counterstrike, one that would turn the skies of Europe into a cauldron once more. And when it came, the Thunderbolt would meet it head-on. Winter 1944. The Ardennes lay under a thick quilt of snow, quiet and deceptively peaceful. Allied pilots played cards in cold Quonset huts, sipping lukewarm coffee and muttering about frostbite. The Luftwaffe, they said, was finished, beaten into silence. But silence can be the prelude to thunder. On the morning of January 1, 1945, the quiet shattered. The Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive, desperate strike meant to destroy Allied air power on the ground. Hundreds of German fighters swept across the front at treetop height, strafing airfields. The first explosions rattled Zemke's hut. He ran outside just in time to see German tracers rip through parked aircraft. Pilots and mechanics dove for cover. Zemke didn't hesitate. "Get airborne," he shouted, sprinting for the flight line. Engines coughed to life. P-47s rolled down icy runways under fire, some taking off with flaps half shot, others lifting just ahead of strafing Focke-Wulfs. The sky turned into a whirling, lethal ballet. Zemke's wolf pack climbed through flak bursts, snow glittering in the pale morning sun. Then they saw them, dozens of Bf-109s and FW-190s scattering like startled crows. "Wolf pack, tally-ho!" Zemke barked into the radio. The jugs pounced. At altitude, the Thunderbolt became the apex predator it had been built to be. Dive, fire, climb, the old drill, now perfected. The big radials howled as they tore through the German formations. Browning spat 13 rounds a second, tearing wings from fuselages, flipping fighters into flaming spirals. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who had once doubted the jug, found himself in a twisting melee with a veteran Luftwaffe ace. The German tried to outclimb him, a fatal mistake. The P-47's engine roared, and Johnson pulled ahead, rolled inverted, and let loose a burst that shredded the Messerschmitt from nose to tail. All across the front, scenes like this played out. Bodenplatte was meant to cripple the Allies. Instead, it became the Luftwaffe's last gasp. Over 200 German aircraft were destroyed in a single day, losses they could never replace. By spring 1945, the Reich skies were empty except for Allied contrails. Thunderbolts ranged freely over Germany, hunting trains, smashing bridges, and silencing flak positions. Colonel Zemke flew one of his last missions in April, strafing a German column near Magdeburg. The war was nearly over, but the jug flew with the same fury as ever. Then, in May, the guns finally fell silent. Zemke stood on a captured German airfield, boots crunching over shattered plexiglass and twisted propellers. The Luftwaffe's once proud fighters lay in rows, burned out, broken, abandoned. A mechanic walked past, dragging a cigarette, and said what everyone was thinking. "Guess they're not laughing anymore, Colonel." Zemke looked at the wreckage, then at the silver Thunderbolt parked at the edge of the field, its nose still streaked with oil. The flying bathtub had escorted bombers, smashed tanks, and outlasted every foe. "The ugly duckling grew teeth," he said quietly. And that was the truth. The Thunderbolt had begun the war as an object of ridicule, too big, too heavy, too slow to ever matter. But by the war's end, it had racked up more air-to-air kills than any other Allied fighter in Europe and destroyed thousands of German vehicles and trains. It wasn't elegant, but it was relentless, the perfect metaphor for the war itself. For the men who flew it, the jug was more than metal and rivets. It was a guardian angel, a steel hammer, a stubborn friend that refused to die even when riddled with holes. Robert Johnson once said of his battered jug, "She got me home when she shouldn't have. That makes her family." And so the story ended not with laughter, but with silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm. On an airfield somewhere in Germany, a lone P-47 sat with its engine ticking as it cooled, steam rising in the morning sun. No one laughed at its shape anymore. It looked less like a milk truck now, and more like a monument, to the pilots who flew, the crews who kept them alive, and to a war that had been fought, and won from the sky. The ugly duckling had not just grown up. It had won the war.